This is what I'll be working on today. This is one of two of these little pull-on micro 25 saws that I've had since about 1974 that run great. The engine's never been apart. I've had carburetor problems, fuel line problems, but the saw itself has been fantastic. You can see two holes in the clutch where you can remove it, and of course an arrow shows which direction. I do not have that special tool. Normally I just use a punch, and you can see where I've used it here, but it didn't work this time. I'm going to have to make a tool and to use with my impact for that. When I make a video, I try to talk in basics to help people that have never done this before. So I talk in simple terms. Now, one thing you need to know about these little saws, I tried to repair that carburetor 3 times years ago. Could not figure out what the problem was. It would not rev up. Well, the problem was the spark arrestor within the muffler was clogged up. So don't overlook that. It can mimic carburetor problems. The red arrow to the right shows the oil line, which is the same as fuel line. The oil line that comes up from the oil reservoir, it's just a press fit in that hole. Nothing holds it. It's just that tight. Metal cover where the blue arrow is where the filter and the orifice to supply oil up to the red arrow to the chain bar is. And the yellow arrow is a screw with a little tang on it that goes into your chain bar for adjustment, as you well know. Poland or Pooland, whichever pronunciation you desire. This shows the fuel line routing underneath and over top of the handle. You can see the blue air filter at the front of the saw. Of course, the carburetor is off. There is a little foam seal underneath the throttle rod that you see right below where the carburetor bolts up. You can make that seal out of a piece of foam rubber, but just be sure that it's secure enough that it won't be sucked into the carburetor. And this is where the fuel line joins here, right beside the fuel cap. The little plastic connection for that, don't break it. Slit that fuel line with a razor blade if it's hard to take it loose from this little connector, black connector. I use the slightly larger 1/4 inch OD tubing where it goes into the fuel tank to make a good tight fitting. The most common line will be a little loose and might leak with you. The oil supply line was broken on both of my saws. Now you have to force this piece out with a punch carefully, and you may even have to use a drill bit to carefully by hand ream that out, because that plastic tubing wants to stick to that aluminum. And you need to blow that oil reservoir out real good when you're finished with your oil lines to get any pieces out of it, of course. This filter is built within this little check valve, and that filter has lasted all these years since 1974, so it's a durable foam material. From the research I've done, this check valve is obsolete now, so I'm going to show you how to fix it. I said that foam element is built within. It's removable. This is a Walbro W carburetor. Don't take out the mixture screws for now. When you clean it, wash it out with some gum cutter, choke cleaner. But don't take your screws out yet, because they rarely ever have particles underneath them. The fuel control diaphragm on the left over time will become brittle and crunchy, like crunching up cellophane. If it's not very pliable, you need to replace it. Very common, very common. The little screw you see here removes a short bar, a fuel control needle, and there's a spring underneath the little lever that operates that. The red arrow shows the little fuel control needle, much like a needle and seat in a car, but this acts more like a power valve. It supplies the fuel to it depending on the position of the fuel control diaphragm on the left. The 90-degree fitting at the bottom of the carburetor was clogged solid with old fuel and oil, a very thick, gummy red substance that I had to clean out with a pick and some choke cleaner. The red arrow shows the fuel inlet hole to the diaphragm. Now that diaphragm uses engine pulses to pump the fuel into the carburetor, so make sure it isn't brittle or torn. The one screw holds it all together. The metal check valve, the oil check valve that goes into the reservoir, it allows crankshaft pressure to pressurize the oil reservoir and force the oil up this tube and out to your chain bar. Both of the check valves shown here are obsolete, not available. You can remove the metal screw-in oil check valve without removing the clutch. I don't have a screwdriver that would go in there. It needs to be a real short 90-degree. But you can use this old 80-year-old mechanic's trick of using a punch and a hammer on the very edge of that check valve to loosen it. Worked like a charm. Don't like to do that, but only option I had right here. Make sure the gasket's good. Screw it back in. Use the punch and hammer again lightly. Just tighten it lightly. Although I'm retired, I still have a fully equipped shop. I could make a 90-degree screwdriver to take this oil check valve out. The check valve would go in here with a little foam element pointed down, and after the check valve is installed, there's another gasket just like this one, then the metal plate. 10-4. The red arrow shows where the metal oil check valve goes. Now there's a small hole that's drilled at the top of this opening that provides pressure to the oil reservoir. I've never seen that clog. You might not have to worry about that now. Maybe later if it doesn't oil, okay? With the oil check valve removed and the filler plug removed, you can see it's a straight shot all the way through this oil reservoir over to the oil plug. And this, of course, is where the oil filler plug goes with the little chain and clip. Now here is where replacing the oil line from the reservoir up to the chain bar hole gets a little complicated. I'll try to explain it. There's only one way I know to do it. It took a few minutes to figure this out because I've never done this before, but it worked just great. This is a 4 photograph of that fuel line, and it is the smaller of the fuel lines. I've forgotten the OD of it, sorry about that. You need to cut that oil line at a steep angle, steeper than what's shown here actually, and put your wire in, make you a little hook, and hook it through that line and clamp it down a little bit with pliers. Lubricate that line and the little hole where it comes out of the block for your chain bar. Lubricate that. I use WD-40 all the time. So lubricate your line and the hole. Insert your wire that you have up through the oil filler plug and out the little hole as shown here. The taper will start through the little hole, and you need to wiggle very carefully. Don't pull too hard, you'll break it loose. Just wiggle it back and forth real carefully, slight pressure, until you get enough of that line to hold with pliers. Then continue on pulling your line through the oil hole in the block until you're past where you made the hole where your wire was inserted through. And once you have that oil line through, you need to trim it off with a razor blade even. Once you have done that, then you can insert your hose on your check valve, being sure that you don't have too much line where it kinks, but of course that you have enough line to hook it to your check valve. The oil seal on my filler cap is still good on both saws after so many years, but you could use an O-ring, I imagine, with no problem. Be sure that the side cover that goes up against the chain bar is clean, because this is the area where the oil will be fed to the bar. You want the hole in the bar clean, and this area too. The fuel line is fed up from the hole in the side of the tank where it goes. Feed that in. Leave enough, not too much that the line will kink. Plug your filter into it and tuck it back down in the fuel tank. Again, use the larger piece of fuel line, which would be 1/4 inch OD, where it goes into the fuel tank so it won't leak. Here you see the proper fuel line routing, and this is a piece of the smaller OD hose. The connector here, you can see the difference between the OD of the hoses. Now here is something you won't find anywhere else on the internet, because I looked. But you can take this valve apart. You can use a socket that's slightly larger than the orifice in the check valve, as shown here. I have a wire inserted in the back of this to where I can take that socket and tap on that valve carefully, and it will drive that little aluminum orifice out, as shown here. This valve was bad on mine, so I had to try to take it apart. I had no option. And it went well, better than I thought. I need to mention to you that both of these valves, this plastic valve and the metal valve that goes in the crankcase, can be tested with your mouth by sucking on it, making sure that you can suck on it one way, but you can't the other. You can't blow one way. It's a check valve, one-way direction only. To get this valve working again, I had to do two things. I had to stretch the spring, you see. I stretched it probably by 3/16 of an inch. And the little aluminum orifice you see at the bottom, the check ball, goes in it just like you see it here. There was something wrong with that little aluminum orifice keeping the check ball from sealing good in it. What I did was take a 1/4 inch bit and by hand only slightly ream a new seat for that check ball. Now, you can test that by putting a piece of 1/4 inch vacuum line over that with the check ball laying inside the hose in this check valve, and you can test it that way before you put this back together to be sure you have a good seal on that ball. I would clean this check valve with some gum cutter, parts cleaner, choke cleaner, and an air hose, and blow it through both ways, the tiny hole at the top and the screen at the bottom. Blow it out good and see if it works. Mine did work, but if it didn't, I would try to use a hook tool in the center of the screen, pull it out because it's probably swedged in the top of this, and underneath it I'm sure you'll find a spring and a metal ball just like the plastic check valve has. Since this valve is no longer available, you would have to find a used one or try to fix this one. But there should be a way to replace that screen once you remove it. Maybe you can re-swedge it, whatever. And this is what I found when I took both chainsaws apart. I've never replaced these oil lines, so they've probably been broken for some time. And this is that reservoir check valve, again with a filter. And remember, the opening to the filter on the back side of this goes down, faces down. And I thought you might like to have the Walbro W parts breakdown. And here is some information I found online. And one of these pages does give credit to a Lynn Graves. Thanks, Lynn. And I hope you've enjoyed this little video I made. I've fixed these saws many times throughout the years. But the only major thing I ever replaced was the ignition coil on one. They've been very reliable saws. I love them. Now just a little bit about my weed eater brush cutter. It's a steel. It has grommets in the fuel tank where the line goes through. The line broke at one of the grommets. I was just going to go over this to tell you how to replace those grommets. They are available from Amazon. If your grommets have hardened over the years, and they probably have, if they're not too hard, you can put a screwdriver behind them, lubricate them with WD-40, Try to pry them out. If you can pry them out a little bit, you can get a hold of the back side of it, or underneath it is a better word, with a pair of needle nose and carefully wiggle it on out. If not, you'll need a new one. Bad photo, but you can see where the fuel line goes here on the carburetor. This is a close place. Lubricate your fuel line and use a needle nose to slip it over this fuel connection. This weed eater brush cutter uses the Walbro carburetor too. Very common carburetor, by the way. Always cut a taper on your fuel line and insert it through your grommet. Make sure you got the fuel line about the correct size and everything. Then you can force the fuel line grommet back into the hole, lubricating it with WD-40 and using a small screwdriver, pushing at the bottom edge and pushing it in a little bit at a time through the hole. It works. Thanks for watching, and now to go outside now that the rain has stopped and see that all these run properly.